The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and floor wax, the kind of sterile, tired scent that clings to government buildings long after the last file is stamped. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold pallor over the faded wooden benches and gray carpeting. Jack Morgan sat near the very back of the room, where the shadows softened the edges of everything. His hands were folded in his lap, calloused fingers interlaced, unmoving. He looked forward, but not at anything. Not the seal behind the judge's bench, not the bailiff, not even the attorneys shuffling papers and whispering in stiff suits. He was looking through the room like a man watching a slow-moving train wreck he'd seen coming a mile away but couldn't step off the tracks in time to avoid. Next to him, his daughter Ella swung her legs just above the floor. Her pink sneakers, scuffed at the toes, tapped an uneven rhythm against the bench. She held her stuffed elephant to her chest like it was a shield. The ear, threadbare and a little lopsided, had been sewn and re-sewn so many times Jack had lost count. Ella had named it Mr. Wiggles when she was 3, and though the name no longer made her giggle, she still brought it everywhere, especially here. The courtroom wasn't crowded, just a few scattered attendees, another custody case in the row ahead, a translator leaning on the aisle wall, 2 young interns pretending not to text, but the room felt full, heavy with the weight of things unspoken, words not allowed, truths that didn't fit neatly into reports. Jack adjusted the collar of his thrifted button-down shirt. He'd ironed it that morning, twice, just to be sure. It didn't change the fact that it hung too loosely on his shoulders, or that his shoes were the same ones he wore for night shifts, but it was the best he could do. There wasn't a tie. He didn't own one anymore. Ella leaned against his side. He felt her tiny body sigh into his ribs, and instinctively he curved his arm around her. Protective, familiar, unnoticed by anyone except the child who needed it. The door near the judge's bench creaked open. A woman in dark robes stepped through, clutching a file folder thick with printouts and statements. The room stood. Jack rose with the others, slow and steady, balancing Ella with one hand as she clutched his belt loop. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Jack sat again, wooden bench creaking beneath him, and glanced down at Ella. Her face was turned up toward his. She was close enough that when she whispered, he didn't have to lean in to hear it. "Don't leave me, Daddy." The words were barely there, just a thread of breath in the stillness, but they shattered something inside him. He didn't answer out loud. He didn't have to. He just reached down, laced his fingers with hers, and gave a single, quiet squeeze. The kind of promise only a child would hear loud enough to believe. The courtroom stood like a single held breath as the judge entered, her black robe flowing behind her in a way that made the fluorescent lighting above flicker just slightly. The sound of people rising, the rustle of fabric, the scrape of shoes on tile, the brief hum of reverence, was not unlike the beginning of a hymn, solemn and scripted. Jack rose with the rest, one hand gently guiding Ella as she slid off the bench and stood beside him. She didn't let go of Mr. Wiggles. Her small fingers clutched the worn fabric like it could hold back the tide. The judge took her seat without ceremony. Middle-aged, with hair pulled into a bun that had surrendered to a few gray strands. She looked like someone who'd seen too much and no longer flinched at the things that made others wince. She opened the thick folder in front of her and began reading silently, her brow furrowed. Jack lowered himself back onto the bench. Ella didn't sit right away. Instead, she turned, slipped her arms around his torso, and pressed her cheek into his chest. It was the kind of hug a child gives when they don't want anyone else to see how scared they are. Quiet, clutching, hopeful. And then came the whisper, "Don't leave me, Daddy." Jack didn't breathe. The words, so soft and small, punched through his chest like a nail driven by hand. He blinked fast, willing the sting behind his eyes to back down. Not now. Not in front of the attorneys and the clerk and the judge who hadn't yet looked in his direction. He didn't have the luxury of falling apart. He wrapped his arms around her, tighter this time, his chin resting lightly on the top of her head. She smelled like cheap shampoo and peanut butter crackers from their rushed breakfast that morning. He wished he'd braided her hair neater. Wished he'd ironed his shirt again. Wished it didn't matter so much, but he knew it did. From the front row, the state attorney cleared her throat and began shuffling papers. She wore a pale gray suit and glasses with frames so thin they looked like wire. Efficient, professional, composed. She leaned over to whisper something to the guardian ad litem seated next to her, both of them nodding without looking back at the man and daughter huddled near the back. Jack could hear the rhythm of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. It didn't match the tempo of the room. It raced ahead, afraid of where the next few hours might take them. He tried to slow it, breathe in, breathe out, but every sound in the courtroom seemed to echo like a threat. Ella pulled back just slightly and looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, glassy but determined. She was too young to understand everything, but not too young to know the difference between staying and being taken. Jack gave her a soft smile, more muscle memory than joy, and brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. He whispered back, barely audible, "I'm right here." And for the moment, that had to be enough. Case number 4927C, State of New York versus Jack Morgan. Custody petition. All parties present, the clerk announced, her voice flat, practiced, like she had said it 100 times this week already. Jack didn't flinch. He'd heard the phrasing before. Versus. As if he were the enemy, as if being tired and broke made him dangerous. He sat up straighter, not in defiance, but in the quiet dignity of a man who'd been preparing for this moment every day for 6 years. Next to him, Ella adjusted Mr. Wiggles in her lap, the elephant now perched like a nervous spectator. The caseworker took the stand. Melissa, mid-30s, navy blouse buttoned to the collar, clipboard hugged to her chest like armor. She spoke with clarity, conviction, and the tired tone of someone whose job required her to draw conclusions from fragments. Jack had met her twice. Once during a home visit where the power had flickered from a blown fuse. Once at the agency office where Ella had spilled juice on the paperwork. That stain was probably still there, a pale pink halo next to Jack's uneven signature. Melissa opened a folder. The folder. This file contains a record of Mr. Morgan's employment history, school attendance for the minor child, notes from previous home visits, and correspondence with the child's maternal grandparents. Jack didn't need to see the pages to know what was inside. He'd lived each bullet point. Mr. Morgan currently works the overnight shift at Hartwell Security. He clocks in at 10 p.m. and leaves at 6 a.m. Monday through Friday. There is no consistent child care support during those hours. While the child is enrolled in school and has not demonstrated signs of neglect, her attendance record indicates multiple tardies over the last academic year. Jack swallowed. He wanted to speak, to explain that some mornings he raced the sunrise home, carrying half-asleep Ella on his hip because the sitter had canceled last minute again, that he stood behind her brushing her teeth with one hand while microwaving oatmeal with the other. But none of that was on paper. Melissa continued. Additionally, Mr. Morgan has been late in paying utility bills on 4 occasions in the past 18 months, resulting in temporary shutoffs twice. One such incident occurred during winter months, though alternate heat sources were confirmed. The judge scribbled something in the margins of the file. Jack's stomach turned. Melissa turned a page. There are also missing health records, including a lapse in dental visits and a missed vision screening. The child's medical needs are not currently urgent, but the inconsistency reflects a pattern. Jack stared down at his hands. Same hands that bandaged Ella's skinned knees, that sewed Mr. Wiggles's ear back on in the middle of the night, that turned pages of bedtime books until his eyes blurred. None of that made it into the folders. Lastly, Melissa said, looking up briefly, Mr. Morgan has no history of criminal behavior, no record of substance abuse, and has consistently demonstrated affection toward the child in all observed interactions. Jack blinked once. But, she added, the state must consider not only the presence of love, but the ability to provide stability. And there it was, the heart of it. Love wasn't on the checklist. Affection didn't count without structure. The state didn't grade on effort, just outcomes. Jack didn't speak, not yet. He just sat there, hollowed and still, as the life he'd built from broken pieces was dismantled one bullet point at a time. Across the aisle, they looked like something from a catalog, well-pressed, well-aged, and perfectly composed. Margaret and Walter Whitmore, Ella's maternal grandparents. Jack had only met them 3 times, all of them strained, civil, and forgettable. They'd sent flowers after Rachel died, a formal note tucked inside the arrangement. With deepest sympathy, it had read, "Not we're here if you need us, not you're not alone, just condolences, cut and dried." Today, Margaret wore a pearl gray suit, her hair swept back into a French twist that didn't dare shift out of place. Walter's blazer matched his tie, both crisp and untouched by time. They sat with their hands folded neatly in their laps, posture upright, expressions reserved. They didn't look angry, just certain. Certain that they were right, certain that this hearing was a formality before the inevitable, certain that Jack, in his slightly frayed collar and coffee-stained resume, was trying his best, and that it still wasn't enough. Jack watched them quietly, feeling the space between them like a chasm. On paper, they were everything the court loved. Retired with a pension. A home in upstate New York with a picket fence and spare bedrooms. A golden retriever named Baxter. A guest room already painted soft lavender, with a twin bed and bookshelves full of award-winning children's novels. They had health insurance and tax records and a statement from their pastor. They belonged to committees and clubs. Their lives were well-lit, evenly paced, the kind of life people envied from the outside. Ella didn't know them, not really. She'd spent a weekend with them 2 summers ago, shortly after Rachel's funeral. Jack remembered dropping her off, the way her tiny backpack swallowed her shoulders, how she clung to his leg while Walter had stood at the door with a practiced smile. Jack had tried to give it a chance, tried to believe they could build something for Ella's sake. But when he picked her up, her words were soft and steady. "They didn't know my bedtime song." That had been enough. He wasn't angry with them. He didn't have the energy. He believed they loved her, believed they meant well. But love wasn't just comfort and clean rooms. It was being there when the school called at noon with a fever. It was knowing which way she liked her sandwich cut and which episode of her favorite cartoon made her cry. It was coloring books on the kitchen table while the rice boiled. It was imperfect, chaotic, and real. The attorney representing the Whitmores stood, buttoning his blazer with a smooth motion. He cleared his throat and began to speak about providing opportunity, about a nurturing environment tailored for growth. Jack didn't catch every word, but he heard enough. Ella would have her own room, ballet lessons, weekend trips to the family lake house. Consistency, predictability, the kind of life Rachel would have wanted for her, the lawyer said, and Jack's throat tightened at the suggestion. But none of them had seen the way Ella crawled into Jack's lap after a nightmare and fell asleep to the rhythm of his heartbeat. None of them had heard her laugh while helping him fix a leaky sink with duct tape and determination. They saw a man exhausted, a man stretched thin. They didn't see the glue holding the pieces together. Margaret looked over just once, her eyes meeting Jack's. There was no malice in her gaze, only pity. That somehow hurt even more. Jack reached for Ella's hand again, her fingers sticky from the lollipop she'd snuck in earlier. She looked up at him with total trust. Across the room, a better life was being pitched like a package deal. But Jack already had a life with her. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. ChatGPT said the name Rachel Morgan sat neatly at the top of a death certificate stapled inside a manila folder. 4 syllables in bold type, surrounded by signatures and government stamps. The judge referred to her as the deceased when reading the case summary, a neutral term, efficient, legal. But to Jack, that word didn't come close. Rachel wasn't deceased. She was his. She was love in its rawest, most inconvenient, most unforgettable form. She was the space in the bed that stayed untouched for over a year. The mug in the cupboard no one else was allowed to use. The hum in the room when music played, even now. Rachel had been a second-grade teacher, the kind who kept glitter in her desk and left encouraging notes in kids' backpacks. She cried every time a student moved away, even if they were troublemakers. She believed in classroom pets and snow day magic and the power of stories told under blankets with flashlights. She wore scarves even in spring, and once made Jack take a poetry class just so they could spend more time together. They met at a food truck festival downtown when Jack had gotten in line for Korean tacos, and she'd overheard him pronounce kimchi wrong. She corrected him with a smirk, then paid for his meal with a wink. He'd been hooked since that moment. She was everything he wasn't, light where he was tired, color where he'd been gray. He used to joke that she was the song and he was the silence in between. And then, suddenly, the song stopped. The accident was brutal. An intersection. A distracted driver. Jack still hated left turns. There had been no long hospital vigil, no bedside goodbyes, just a phone call, a siren, a sterile hallway, and the kind of silence that crushes air from your lungs. Ella had been 4, too young to understand, old enough to notice. In the days that followed, Jack moved through the world like a man underwater. He didn't cry at the funeral, not because he didn't want to, but because he physically couldn't. It was like his body refused to let go of the last threads holding him together. Rachel's parents had taken over the service, ordering the flowers, writing the program, choosing the photo where she was wearing a blouse Jack had always thought was too formal for her. They hadn't asked his opinion. He didn't argue. Not then. He was trying to figure out how to get Ella to sleep without Rachel's lullabies. Afterward, the world didn't pause for his grief. The rent still came due. Lunchboxes still had to be packed. Ella still wanted the crusts cut off. Jack did it all, sometimes with grace, more often with trembling hands and a deep ache in his chest that never fully went away. To the court, Rachel Morgan was a footnote, a legal marker that initiated this entire process, a checkbox in a file labeled custody reassignment. But to Jack and Ella, she was wind chimes on the porch and the smell of banana pancakes on Sunday mornings. She was the reason Ella knew how to sing off-key without shame. She was the one Jack still talked to in the dark, when the weight of trying to be both parents pressed too hard on his ribs. She was gone, but she wasn't absent, and no matter how many folders they filled, no matter how many bullet points they read aloud, they'd never find a form that captured what she meant. Jack reached into his pocket and touched the charm on his keychain, her wedding ring, threaded onto a silver loop, a quiet ritual, one he did without thinking. The court could call her deceased. He still called her love. It started with a scraped knee and a sentence taken out of context. Ella had tripped during recess. Nothing dramatic, just a tumble on the playground mulch. She came home with a tear in her leggings and a smear of dirt across her cheek, her palms scuffed pink from trying to catch herself. Jack had washed the scrape gently with warm water and soap, the way Rachel used to do, then covered it with one of the sparkly Band-Aids Ella preferred. She didn't cry, not then, not until bedtime, when she whispered that her knee still hurt like when Mommy left. Jack had frozen. She didn't mean it like that. He knew she didn't, but grief doesn't speak in adult logic. To Ella, left was just a word for pain that sticks around too long. Still, he had gently pulled her onto his lap, brushing her hair back as she leaned her head against his chest. "Mommy didn't leave you," he'd whispered. "She loved you with her whole heart. She just had to go somewhere you couldn't follow." Ella hadn't replied. She just wrapped her arms around his neck and asked him to sing the lullaby she never let anyone else hear. The next day at daycare, a part-time assistant overheard Ella telling another child, "My daddy says Mommy left because it hurt too much." The assistant, who had only worked there 2 weeks, noted the skinned knee and filed an incident report, just to be safe. Jack found out 2 days later when a social worker knocked on his apartment door at 7:13 p.m. He was wearing an old t-shirt. The living room was a mess, laundry half folded, dinner dishes still in the sink, Ella halfway through a drawing on the floor. The cartoon playing in the background was too loud. It wasn't ideal, but it was home. The woman introduced herself calmly, badge visible but not aggressive, voice steady. Jack's stomach dropped as she explained the situation. A wellness check, she called it. Routine. She asked if she could come in. Jack didn't argue. He just stepped aside. Ella greeted her like she would anyone. Bright smile, gap-toothed charm, holding Mr. Wiggles by the ear. "We're coloring," she announced. "My dad made me macaroni with hot dogs cut up like octopuses." She held up the drawing. It was a picture of a big man and a small girl standing under a rainbow. Jack's eyes stung when he saw it. The social worker stayed 30 minutes. She checked the fridge, glanced around the rooms, asked Ella a few soft questions about bedtime and school. Nothing invasive, nothing harsh. But Jack felt every second like he was standing trial without knowing the charges. He wasn't perfect. He knew that. He forgot things. He worked too many hours. He once spilled chocolate milk on Ella's permission slip and mailed it in anyway, but he wasn't unfit. Still, the gears had started to turn. 2 weeks later, he received the letter. Due to a report filed on date, the department recommends a formal evaluation of custody arrangements to ensure the best interest of the child. The letter was polite, cold, efficient. It didn't accuse, it didn't condemn, it simply recommended. But recommendations become motions, motions become hearings, hearings become decisions, and suddenly a scraped knee and a misunderstood sentence became a courtroom, a folder, a fight. Jack stared at the paper for a long time that night while Ella slept in the next room, curled up in the blanket Rachel had crocheted before the accident. He hadn't raised his voice once, hadn't cursed or thrown anything. He just sat in the dim light of the kitchen, holding a letter that made him feel like the ground beneath their lives had begun to shift, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. The judge looked up from the paperwork, her pen paused midair. "Mr. Morgan," she said, voice firm but not unkind, "you may take the stand." Jack hesitated for a second, not because he wasn't ready. He had been rehearsing this moment in his head for weeks, but because once he stood, there would be no curtain to hide behind, no muffled silence to take shelter in, just him, under the weight of fluorescent lights and quiet judgment. He rose slowly, like every step was carrying something invisible but immense. His shoulders, broad and tired, rolled forward slightly as if bracing for a blow that might not come but probably would. He buttoned the second button of his shirt, the one that always came undone, and walked to the front of the room. The bailiff asked him to raise his right hand. He did. His palm trembled slightly. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." He sat, adjusted the mic, cleared his throat, looked around, and then he didn't speak, not right away. He looked over at Ella, her legs swinging, eyes big, chin resting on Mr. Wiggles's head. He smiled softly, as if pulling courage from the little face that had kept him going all these years. "I don't have exhibits to present," he began, voice gravelly from disuse, "or a binder full of polished arguments. I'm not here to prove I'm perfect." He paused. "Because I'm not." He let that sit. "When my wife died, Ella was 4, and I didn't know how to braid hair. I didn't know how to get bubblegum out of carpet, or how to get a child to eat vegetables that weren't shaped like dinosaurs. I didn't know how to balance a grief that felt like drowning with a little girl who needed songs and silliness just to fall asleep." He looked down at his hands, rubbed his thumb over a callus. "I learned." The courtroom was still, not out of politeness, but because everyone, even the clerk, had gone quiet inside. "I watched YouTube videos on how to do pigtails. I practiced on a stuffed animal for 2 weeks before I tried it on her. I burnt dinner more times than I care to admit. I worked night shifts so I could be there in the morning to pack her lunch, even if that meant writing dumb jokes on Post-it notes just so she'd smile when she opened it." He looked toward the judge now, his voice steadier. "I'm tired. A lot. I miss appointments sometimes. I forget where I parked. I use duct tape more than a grown man should. But every night, every single night, I read her a story before bed. even when I can barely keep my eyes open, even when my feet hurt from 10 hours on concrete floors. His voice caught just slightly. Because I promised her. He paused again, not to collect himself, but to choose his next words with care. I promised her that even if the world got louder, even if everything else fell apart, she would always have one place where she was safe, where she was wanted, where she was known. He leaned in slightly, quieter now. I'm not raising her to be lucky. I'm raising her to be loved. The judge didn't speak. No one did. Not yet. Jack sat back in the chair, exhaled slowly, and rested his hands in his lap. That was all he had. No case law, no expert witnesses, just the truth. When Jack stood again, he didn't walk like someone making a second case. He walked like someone holding something sacred. In his hands was a small spiral-bound sketchbook, the kind with a cardboard cover and pages that curled at the corners from use. It had little flecks of glitter stuck in the spine and a smudge of jelly on the back cover. Ella's name was written on the front in purple marker, the E backward, the way she used to write it when she first learned how. He approached the clerk with quiet steps and handed it over. She looked at him, then at the judge, unsure. May I? Jack asked, voice soft. The judge raised an eyebrow. Is this an exhibit, Mr. Morgan? No, Your Honor, he said. Just context. There was a pause, a moment when it felt like the courtroom might shift back into its formal spine. Then the judge nodded. The clerk carried the sketchbook up and laid it carefully on the bench. The judge opened it, just one page, then another, and another. The frown she wore by default, the one built into the muscle memory of courtrooms and custody battles, began to soften. Not dramatically, just slightly, like a curtain letting in a crack of light. The first page showed a man and a girl standing under a crooked rainbow. The man was tall, drawn in brown crayon, his arms wide, smile simple. The girl had blonde pigtails and a bright pink dress. She was holding the man's hand. Over the rainbow, Ella had written in blocky, uneven letters, Me and Daddy. Another page showed the man again, same tired eyes, but this time he was standing in a kitchen with a frying pan. Next to it, a bubble read, Macaroni again, huh? And beneath that, in a messy scrawl, But I love when he cooks. The judge turned a few more pages, each one louder in its honesty than the testimonies had been all morning. A picture of a couch, a blanket, a TV glowing with stars, the man and girl curled up together, a stuffed elephant between them. Another with a Band-Aid being placed on a knee, Ella's figure smiling through tears. On one page, in purple crayon with a red heart drawn beside it, were the words, My dad is my safe place. That's when the courtroom breathed a little quieter. Not just the judge, everyone. The attorney for the grandparents shifted in his chair. Margaret Whitmore adjusted the clasp on her purse. Even the bailiff, whose eyes rarely strayed from protocol, looked down and blinked once, long and slow. The judge lingered on that page. Jack didn't speak. He didn't have to. That sketchbook, smudged and sticky, filled with messy color and unfiltered feeling, held more testimony than any affidavit could. It was a diary of dinners made on tired feet, songs sung off-key, and morning walks to school in mismatched gloves. After a long silence, the judge closed the book gently. She didn't set it aside. She kept it there, near her gavel, as if it belonged alongside the legal documents. Jack returned to his seat. Ella reached up and laced her fingers through his. He squeezed her hand twice. They both knew what that meant. Still here. Still us. The social worker took the stand with a practiced kind of composure. Her blazer was pressed, her voice even, and she held a yellow legal pad like it contained absolute truth. Jack didn't know her name before today. She'd visited their apartment once, unannounced, when Ella was home sick and Jack had just finished a double shift. He'd answered the door with a bowl of soup in one hand and his shirt inside out. It hadn't gone well. She adjusted the microphone, cleared her throat. Mr. Morgan is the child's biological father. He has been her sole guardian since the passing of the mother approximately 2 years ago. Her voice was professional. Not cold, exactly. Just procedural. His current employment is part-time overnight security at a commercial office complex. He has no secondary income. Housing is shared. He rents the second floor of a duplex unit with month-to-month tenancy. Jack sat still. He didn't blink. Didn't shift. Only his jaw moved, tightening slightly, the muscle along his cheek flaring with each sentence. Mr. Morgan does not currently receive financial support from any extended family. He has declined state child care services due to inconsistent shift coverage and has not yet secured a long-term child care solution for overnight hours. While the child is enrolled in public school and there are no documented incidents of neglect, her routine appears inconsistent based on school records and prior welfare checks. She wasn't wrong, not exactly. But she also wasn't telling the whole story. There was no mention of how Jack had left 2 jobs because the shifts didn't line up with Ella's school hours, or how he'd turned down a higher-paying position that would have meant missing bedtime 5 nights a week. There was no mention of the neighbor next door, Miss Roberta, who watched Ella when emergencies came up, or the way Jack slept in short, fractured bursts just to be there for morning routines. Regarding environment, the social worker continued, the home was clean during the visit, modest, no hazards observed. The child's room is shared with her father, though separated by a curtain for privacy. Meals appear to be home prepared. Clothing is worn but seasonally appropriate. Jack didn't react to that either. He knew what seasonally appropriate meant. It meant the coat he'd found at Goodwill was good enough, but not impressive. It meant her snow boots were last year's size, but she hadn't complained. There is no evidence of physical or emotional abuse, she added. No signs of addiction or criminal behavior. The child appears bonded to Mr. Morgan. However, she paused, as if this next part required a gentler tone. However, bonding is only one factor. The court must consider the child's long-term access to stability, educational support, and emotional consistency. Ella shifted beside him, her head resting lightly on his arm. Her body was warm, her presence a reminder of why this all mattered. Jack didn't look at the judge. He didn't need to. He could feel the scrutiny in every corner of the room. It was the same look he got at grocery stores when he used coupons or paid in cash. The same look he'd seen on teachers' faces when he forgot picture day. The social worker finished her testimony and stepped down. She wasn't cruel. She hadn't twisted facts or raised her voice. She was doing her job, following policy, painting the picture she was trained to see. But policy didn't account for 3 a.m. lullabies sung off-key to calm nightmares. It didn't measure safety by the way a child instinctively reaches for a hand and finds it every time. The system wasn't built for soft hands like Jack's, hands that held grief and love in equal weight, that showed up every day without applause, that made magic out of nothing. And yet, here he was, still holding on. The judge set her pen down, the soft clink of it on the bench louder than it should have been. She had listened through the testimony with a quiet, inscrutable face, had nodded when she needed to, taken notes with neat, looping handwriting. But now she looked directly at Jack for the first time since he'd taken the stand. Not through him. At him. Her gaze wasn't harsh, but it wasn't easy to hold either. It was the kind of look that sifted through masks and rehearsed lines and went straight for the marrow. "Mr. Morgan," she said, voice calm, steady. "Do you believe you're enough for your daughter?" The question landed like a weight in the middle of the courtroom. No rustling papers, no whispered sidebar, just silence, the deep, thick kind that makes every breath feel too loud. Jack felt his chest tighten, not in anger, not in fear exactly, just in the ache of being seen too clearly. He looked down at his hands. The same hands that had turned doorknobs in the dark to check on a sleeping child. That had stirred instant oatmeal while scribbling, "You've got this," napkin for Ella's lunchbox. that had patched stuffed animals, zipped jackets, and caught tears before they hit the floor. He didn't speak right away. And maybe that was the most honest part. Because he'd asked himself that question more times than he could count. At 2 a.m. in a grocery store aisle, wondering if off-brand cereal would be enough this week. At the pediatrician's office, apologizing for a missed appointment. In the moments when Ella asked about her mother, and he had no new words to offer, just the same soft answers, rearranged. He lifted his head slowly, meeting the judge's eyes. She didn't rush him. She just waited. "I don't always know," he said quietly. The words weren't loud, weren't wrapped in polish or performance. They just were. Simple. Real. He let out a small breath and continued. "I have days where I feel like I'm holding it all together with duct tape and borrowed time. Days where I mess up, miss things. Days where I worry that loving her more than anything might still not be enough to keep her." His voice didn't tremble, but it didn't need to. There was a truth in it that filled the room more than volume ever could. "But I never stopped trying." He paused there, not for effect, just because there was nothing else to add. That was the answer, not a speech, not a defense, just the daily act of showing up. The judge held his gaze a second longer, then nodded once. A small gesture, barely a motion, but it felt like a release valve in a room that had forgotten how to breathe. Jack sat back down beside Ella. She reached for his hand again, and this time, it wasn't just comfort. It was recognition. It wasn't in the docket. No one expected it. Not Jack, not the attorneys, not even the clerk who shuffled nervously when the judge leaned forward and asked, "Would the child like to speak?" There was a moment of stillness. A held breath. Jack looked at Ella, wide-eyed beside him, her small fingers squeezing Mr. Wiggles until the stuffing bunched in awkward lumps. She blinked up at him, searching his face. He didn't nod, didn't push her. He just looked back with something steadier than permission, trust. Ella slid off the bench with quiet determination. Her shoes squeaked against the floor as she walked the length of the courtroom, her arms wrapped tightly around the worn elephant like a life preserver. The courtroom, so formal and full of adult complications, shrank just a little in that moment to fit her. The bailiff guided her gently to the witness seat, adjusted the microphone, and whispered something kind and low. Ella didn't smile, but she didn't flinch either. She sat, straight-backed, Mr. Wiggles cradled in her lap. The judge gave a small smile. "Hi, Ella. Do you know why you're here?" Ella nodded. "Because some people think I should live in a different house." The judge tilted her head. "And how do you feel about that?" Ella looked down at her elephant, thought for a moment, then looked back up. "I don't want to go." The judge kept her voice gentle. "Can you tell me why?" Ella shrugged. "Because I already have a house. It's not big, but it has my drawings on the fridge, and Dad always lets me put extra syrup on pancakes." A small wave of restrained smiles moved through the room, quickly stifled. The judge nodded. "And what's your favorite thing about your dad?" Ella's voice brightened slightly. "He tucks me in with songs. Even when he's sleepy, he makes up new ones sometimes. They're silly." The judge smiled. "Anything else?" Ella scrunched her nose. "He smells like coffee and safety." Jack felt something split open in his chest. He kept his eyes down, not trusting them to stay dry if he looked up. His knuckles were white, gripping the edge of the bench. The judge glanced toward the guardian ad litem, then back to Ella. "And if I had to make a choice about where you live, is there anything you'd want me to know?" Ella took a breath, the kind only a 6-year-old would consider brave. Then she said, quiet and clear, "I want to stay. I want to stay with my dad." That was it. No rehearsed lines, no coaxing. Just a little girl holding a stuffed elephant, telling the truth like it was the most obvious thing in the world. The judge leaned back slightly, pen forgotten. No more questions followed. The clerk helped Ella down from the seat. She didn't run back to Jack. She walked, head high, like she had done something important and knew it. When she climbed back into the pew beside him, she didn't say anything, just leaned into his side and exhaled. Jack didn't speak either. He couldn't, but he reached over and rested his hand on the back of her head, fingers gently tangled in her hair. And for the first time all day, he allowed himself to believe maybe love could be enough. The judge's pen moved in slow, deliberate strokes, not frantic, not mechanical, purposeful. Each note scribbled on the yellow legal pad before her felt like it carved something permanent into the day. She didn't speak, didn't glance up, just wrote. On either side of the room, the attorneys leaned in to whisper, low, guarded murmurs that fluttered like moths in the quiet. The court reporter paused, hands hovering just above her keyboard. Even the bailiff shifted his stance, as if the room itself was bracing for something. Jack exhaled, long and low, but the breath didn't loosen anything in him. His shoulders remained high, his jaw still tight. He wasn't built for premature relief, not anymore. Hope had become a cautious thing, earned only in hindsight. Ella had returned to her seat, climbing up beside him without a word. She nestled against his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world, like she hadn't just walked into the heart of the storm and spoken truth the adults couldn't seem to reach on their own. Her fingers found his, laced them, the same way she did when crossing the street, like she trusted him to lead her somewhere safe. Between them, Mr. Wiggle sat on the bench like a silent witness. His worn fabric and sagging ear gave him the look of something ancient and wise. The courtroom lighting glinted off the cheap plastic of his bead eyes, making him look oddly dignified, like he too understood what this moment meant. Jack didn't dare look around the room. He could feel the gazes, some soft with sympathy, others unreadable. The Whitmores were silent. Margaret sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her expression calm but stiff. Walter's gaze was lowered, jaw clenched like he was holding back thoughts that had nowhere appropriate to go. The judge stopped writing. She closed the folder in front of her, not quickly but with finality. She rested both hands on top of it, fingers steepled. Her eyes moved across the room slowly, taking in everyone. Jack felt his stomach twist. The silence stretched again, that unbearable, thick kind, the kind that holds every version of the future at once. But she didn't speak yet. She looked down once more, tapped her pen twice on the wood. Then, finally, gently said, "I'll need a brief recess before I return with my decision." There was a rustle, benches shifting, papers gathered, heels against tile, but it all felt muffled, distant, like the underwater part of a dream. Jack remained still. So did Ella. She didn't ask what recess meant. She just leaned a little harder into his side, clutching his hand tighter. He looked down at her. Her eyes were calm, steady, braver than most adults he'd known. He nodded once, not to her, to himself. The weight had shifted. Not lifted, not yet. But it had moved, off his chest just enough to breathe, and maybe, just maybe, onto the side where love lived, where truth didn't need perfect grammar or income statements to be recognized. He closed his eyes for a moment. Not to rest, just to hold it, that impossible fragile thing, a sliver of hope. The hallway outside the courtroom was colder than Jack remembered. Every time the door swung open behind him, he could feel the stale rush of air conditioning blowing against his back like a reminder. This isn't over. He sat on the concrete steps outside the courthouse, elbows resting on his knees, palms folded loosely between them. His jacket was draped over the railing, forgotten. His tie, the one he'd borrowed from his neighbor, was now tugged loose and lopsided. Ella was inside, in the care of the court-appointed child liaison, coloring, probably, or telling some story about Mr. Wiggles's adventures through space. She had been remarkably calm through all of it, but Jack could feel the wear beginning to fray around the edges. The day was long, too big for a 6-year-old's shoulders. Honestly, it was too big for his. He stared down at the sidewalk, tracing the cracks with his eyes. He didn't feel relief. Not yet, just the familiar quiet that came after giving everything you have and knowing it still might not be enough. The sound of footsteps didn't register at first, but then a voice, familiar and warm, broke through the dull hum of cars passing. "Jack?" He looked up. Celia Raymond. She stood at the bottom of the steps in a soft lavender blouse and a long cardigan, her tote bag tucked under one arm. Her hair was pulled back in a way that made her look younger, though her eyes had the same softness, the same knowing gentleness he remembered. "Celia," he said, slowly rising to his feet. What are you doing here?" "I heard," she said simply. "Through the grapevine. I still get emails from the district sometimes. When I saw the name..." Jack blinked, trying to process it. "I didn't call anyone. I didn't want to pull favors." She smiled. "You didn't. But I don't need an invitation to speak the truth." They stood in silence for a moment, the years between them stretching and collapsing all at once. "How is she?" Celia asked. "Ella?" Jack's voice softened. "She's okay, scared maybe, but stronger than I deserve." Celia gave a small nod. "That sounds about right." Then she surprised him, reaching out and placing a hand on his shoulder, firm but kind. "Wait here a minute," she said. "I have something to say." Jack watched as she climbed the steps and disappeared through the courthouse doors, her figure swallowed up by the bureaucratic quiet of the building. He sat back down, numb, confused, a little afraid to hope. Inside, the judge remained at the bench, shuffling papers when the door opened. Celia approached without hesitation, speaking briefly to the bailiff before being waved forward. She didn't sit. She leaned in, whispering, voice low and even. Her words weren't recorded. The court reporter wasn't present. No one took notes. But the judge listened, really listened. Jack never knew what was said, but when Celia stepped back out into the sunlight 15 minutes later, her expression was calm, satisfied. Her eyes met Jack's and she gave the smallest nod, barely more than a breath of movement, but it held weight. And when the judge returned to the courtroom not long after, her face looked the same as it had all day. Except for one thing, just slightly. Her brow had softened. The bailiff's voice rang out, low and clear. "All rise." Chairs creaked, shoes scraped against the floor. Jack stood slowly, lifting Ella up beside him, her hand already wrapped around his. Her grip was tighter than usual, less playful, more instinctive. Mr. Wiggles was tucked under her arm, one ear dragging slightly, the fabric threadbare from years of comfort. The judge re-entered the courtroom with a calm, steady stride. She carried no papers in her hands. The folder, the notepad, even her pen had been left behind. It was the first time Jack realized how small she was, not in stature, but in presence, deliberately so, like she knew her role wasn't to fill the room with authority, but to weigh it. She sat, folded her hands on the bench, and looked out at the courtroom with a gaze that no longer skimmed over details, but reached into the cracks between people. This time, when her eyes passed over Jack, they lingered for just a second longer. "You may be seated," she said. The room settled. Jack could hear every sound, the rustling of jackets, a cough from somewhere in the gallery, the subtle crinkle of a candy wrapper that someone instantly regretted opening. But beneath it all was something deeper. Breath. The room was breathing, carefully, slowly, together. The judge spoke, not in legalese or cold language, but with the cadence of someone who had thought hard about what needed to be said. "I've presided over many custody cases," she began. "Some are clear, some are complex. This one is human." Her voice was steady but soft, like she didn't want to scare anyone away from listening closely. "There are systems in place meant to help us determine what is best for a child. Forms, evaluations, checklists. But no system, none, can fully measure love, or effort, or the quiet ways a parent shows up day after day, even when the world gives them every reason not to." Jack stared at her, frozen. His hand had gone cold, but Ella's stayed warm in his. "This court has reviewed financial documents, housing arrangements, employment history. We've heard from professionals, from caregivers, and from family. She paused. And then we heard from Ella. A small ripple moved through the courtroom, a subtle shift in posture. Even the attorneys looked up from their notes. She reminded us that safety isn't always found in square footage or polished routines. Sometimes it's in a voice that sings to you when you're scared, in a hand that holds yours in silence, in a father who, though imperfect, has built a life around the heartbeat of his daughter. Jack swallowed hard. This is not a ruling against the maternal grandparents. Their love for Ella is evident. Their home is stable and warm. But love is not just provision. It is presence. Another pause. This court awards full legal and physical custody of Ella Morgan to her father, Jack Morgan, with a provision for monthly check-ins and access to continued support resources. The room didn't cheer. It didn't clap. It breathed. Jack didn't move, not right away. His grip on Ella's hand never loosened, but it trembled slightly. He looked down at her. Her eyes were wide, searching his face for confirmation. He nodded. And for the first time all day, her shoulders dropped, just a little, like she could finally rest. The judge wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "you're not expected to be perfect. You're expected to be present. Keep showing up." Jack could only nod again. His voice wasn't ready yet, but his heart was. The judge's voice softened as the final words of the ruling settled over the courtroom like fresh snow. Quiet, unmistakable, and irreversible. There were no gasps, no shouts, no celebratory outbursts, just a stillness that seemed to hush even the hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead. Jack didn't move, not right away. He felt Ella's hand tighten in his, a small reflex of security, of confirmation. He blinked slowly, letting the words catch up with him. Full custody. The two words hung there like a fragile ornament he was afraid to touch too quickly. Real, but so easily breakable. The judge leaned slightly forward again, her hands still folded over the edge of the bench. She looked directly at him now, no paperwork between them, no legalese to shield the moment. "There will be conditions," she said. "Monthly check-ins with the Department of Family Services, attendance in a parenting support group, something local and consistent. I'd also encourage participation in any emotional or grief counseling offered through the community network." Jack nodded once, already doing the math in his head, rearranging shifts, planning transportation, but he didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. Gladly. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then glanced down at the file again. Maybe more out of habit than need. Her hand rested on the sketchbook Ella had given her earlier. It was closed now, but still near. Still close enough to feel like it mattered. She looked up once more. Her tone changed, not official, not rehearsed, just human. "You're not perfect, Mr. Morgan." Jack's breath caught, but he didn't flinch. The judge let the words hang there for a beat before continuing. "But you are present." She paused again. This time her eyes softened just slightly, and when she spoke, her voice landed like something personal, something passed down rather than handed out. "And that matters." Jack didn't expect to feel it the way he did. Those last three words cracked something open in him. Not like breaking, but like a door left ajar after being shut for too long. He felt his throat tighten, but he nodded again, slower this time. Not a polite nod, a full-bodied, "I heard you" kind of nod. "Thank you," he said quietly, but it came out thick, gravel pressed through gratitude. "Truly." The judge turned to the clerk and gave a small motion. "We're adjourned." The gavel came down, not with force, but with finality. A soft thud. Then papers rustled, people stood, chairs scraped against the floor like the shifting of a theater after the curtain falls. Jack remained seated. Ella, still beside him, had turned fully into his side now, her head against his ribs, Mr. Wiggles smooshed between them. She didn't say a word, just breathed in sync with him, like even her lungs knew something had changed. He bent low and kissed the crown of her head. "You did good, kiddo," he whispered. "We did good." And in that moment, he didn't feel like a man barely hanging on. He felt like a father, finally standing tall. Jack had always been the kind of man who held things in. He was made of clenched jaws and quiet shoulders, the kind of person who absorbed every blow in silence and kept moving. Grief, exhaustion, even joy. He processed it all behind steady eyes and a closed mouth, like showing too much might undo the delicate balance of keeping it together. So when the verdict was read, when the gavel dropped and the courtroom shifted from tension to relief, he didn't cry. He simply sat still, letting the words echo in the hollowed-out spaces inside him. Full custody, monthly check-ins, support groups. All of it sounded like grace disguised as structure, something the system gave sparingly, but today gave in his favor. He had expected to feel something sharp, overwhelming. But what he felt instead was stillness, like a storm that had finally moved on, leaving the sky oddly clear and wide. Ella hadn't spoken yet. She stayed close to his side, still holding Mr. Wiggles, her knees folded up under her dress, sneakers dangling off the edge of the bench. Her hair had come loose from the little braid he'd managed that morning, and now it curled at her cheeks in soft, uneven tendrils. She looked younger in that moment, or maybe just more at peace. Then she tugged at his sleeve. It was small, barely a pull, but it was enough. He looked down, and she was already looking up at him. Her eyes were bright, not watery. Her face serious in that way kids get when they're saying something they know matters. "I knew you wouldn't leave me," she whispered. And that's when it happened. He broke. Not loudly, not in a way that interrupted the room or called attention. There was no gasp, no dramatic covering of the face, just the slow crumbling collapse of a man who had carried more than he thought possible, and now had nowhere left to store it. His eyes filled too fast for him to blink it away. A tear fell, unexpected and unashamed, catching on the edge of his cheekbone before tracing a quiet line to his jaw. Another followed, then another. He covered his mouth with one hand and leaned into Ella, pulling her against him like she was the only anchor he had left in a world that had just tilted back into balance. She wrapped her arms around him without hesitation, her cheek pressing against his chest. The stuffed elephant got wedged between them, but neither noticed. Behind the bench, the judge sat back slightly. Her expression, always so controlled, softened to something that looked almost maternal. She reached up once, quickly, discreetly, and brushed the corner of her eye. Then she smiled. Small, quiet, but real. The attorneys began to gather their files. The bailiff turned to open the doors. But for one brief moment, the heart of the room wasn't in the verdict or the paperwork. It was right there, in the pew, where a tired father cried not because he had lost, but because he had finally, unbelievably, won. Not against the system, not even against the odds, but against the silence that had been telling him for so long that he might not be enough. And now, with Ella's voice in his ear and her arms around his ribs, he knew better. The door creaked the way it always did when they came home, low and a little stubborn, like even the hinges were tired. Jack nudged it open with his shoulder, Ella trailing behind him, still clutching Mr. Wiggles, her small backpack slung off one arm. The apartment smelled faintly of garlic from last night's dinner and the cinnamon-scented candle he always forgot to blow out. He paused just inside the doorway, taking a breath that felt different this time. Not relieved exactly, not triumphant, just whole. Ella darted toward the kitchen table without waiting for instruction, the way kids do when a space feels theirs again. She dropped her backpack with a soft thud and slid into her usual seat, already reaching for the coloring book left open from the day before. Crayon shavings littered the table's corner, and a few pages had bled color onto the laminate surface, but Jack didn't care. It was her art. Her territory. Her sanctuary. Jack shrugged off his coat and hung it by the door, his body moving slower than it used to. Not from exhaustion today, but from the gravity of still being here, of still being Dad. He stepped into the kitchen and opened the fridge. It groaned like always. The light flickered. The Tupperware from 2 nights ago sat in the middle, filled with overcooked spaghetti and a sauce that had thickened overnight. He took it out anyway. He set the container on the counter and popped the lid. The scent of tomato and too much oregano filled the room. He grabbed 2 bowls and set them on the counter, then turned to the microwave. The keypad had a crack running through the 5 and 7. Ella had spilled juice on it months ago. Jack pressed the buttons gently anyway. As the microwave hummed, he walked over to the table, brushing his fingers lightly over Ella's hair. She was coloring a picture of a house. Windows too big, the sun impossibly large, smoke curling out of a chimney like a cartoon. But in the window, there were 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, both smiling. "Who's that?" he asked softly, crouching beside her. She looked up at him, eyes wide and easy. "It's us." Jack didn't say anything. He just kissed the top of her head and stood slowly. The microwave beeped behind him. He served the pasta into their bowls, sprinkled the last bit of shredded cheese over each, and set them on the table. He didn't light a candle or put on music. He didn't need to. The room already felt lit in some unspoken way. As Ella twirled noodles onto her fork, Jack opened his laptop. The screen took a second to load, then blinked to life. He navigated to the website the judge had mentioned, local parenting support classes. Most were at night, which worked. He signed up without overthinking. It wasn't prideful or desperate. It was necessary, and he was ready. The radiator kicked in along the wall, clanking and hissing like it always did. The fridge buzzed in reply. The apartment still had stains on the ceiling, and the floor creaked near the bathroom. Nothing had changed, not really. They still lived above a laundromat, still used box fans in the summer. But now it all felt different. Not because of square footage or neighborhood zip codes, but because Ella was still here. Because he was still hers. Jack looked around the apartment, not with longing, but with quiet acceptance. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And as Ella giggled at a long noodle that wouldn't stay on her fork, Jack realized something he hadn't let himself believe until now. Home isn't always a house. Sometimes it's a coloring book on a chipped table, a bowl of leftover spaghetti, a laptop screen glowing with new beginnings, and sometimes it's just the sound of a child laughing in a room where her father still lives. Ella was already half asleep by the time Jack pulled the blanket over her shoulders. Her fingers were still curled loosely around Mr. Wiggles, the frayed edge of one ear clutched between her thumb and forefinger like a worry stone. The glow from the nightlight spilled across her face, softening the freckles on her nose and casting the room in amber. Outside the window, the city hummed low and steady, an occasional siren in the distance, the hum of tires over wet asphalt, life carrying on. Jack sat beside her on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb the creaky spot near the footboard. His hands rested in his lap, his body finally allowed to go still after days of courtroom chairs and cafeteria coffee and breath held so long it had started to feel normal. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't see a countdown hovering behind her smile. "Daddy?" she mumbled, her voice drowsy but clear. "Yeah, baby. You're staying, right?" His heart caught. It wasn't the question itself, it was the way she asked it, not as a test, not from uncertainty, but as a final check, a child's way of double-knotting the laces just to be sure. He leaned in closer, brushing a strand of hair away from her cheek. "Always," he whispered. She didn't nod, didn't smile. She just closed her eyes and let out a breath that sounded like trust. A quiet exhale of everything she'd been holding in, because now she didn't have to anymore. Jack stayed there long after her breathing evened out, long after the quiet turned to stillness. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, the soft twitch of her fingers as dreams began to take hold. The room smelled faintly of laundry detergent and cinnamon from the candle still flickering faintly in the kitchen. He'd blow it out soon, but not yet. There was no grand finale to this day, no crowd waiting at the steps of the courthouse, no medals for endurance, no headlines announcing the quiet miracle of a man being allowed to keep his daughter. Just a small room in a second-floor apartment where the baseboards chipped and the heater clicked, and two people who had lost too much were finally allowed to remain whole. He stood slowly and walked to the doorway, glancing back one last time. She didn't stir. There were still bills to pay, still hours to cover, still parent-teacher conferences and permission slips and grocery runs that would feel like puzzles missing pieces. But now there was this too, this hush, this shelter, this simple night where nothing dramatic happened and everything changed anyway. The court had spoken, yes, but this room, this moment, this promise was the real verdict. Love, imperfect and unpolished, had been enough. Not love with matching napkins and college funds, not love wrapped in financial security or dressed in weekend visits to dance recitals. Just love that shows up, that braids hair unevenly, that stays through the questions and the court dates and the daycare reports, that says always and means it. Jack closed the door gently behind him, the latch clicking shut like a vow sealed. And in that ordinary silence, something sacred settled. What they had couldn't be measured, and thank God for that.